1 Kings chapter 19. We'll read in just a minute. I want to show you a collage of pictures first. And I want to ask you, do you know what all of these people have in common? Like, don't say like they're all Americans or anything, because that's Prince Harry. He wouldn't like that, all right? So they're not all singers, all right? We've got a couple singers up there, Eminem, Dolly Parton. Does anybody know what? Here's what they all have in common. All of them are severely struggle with depression. Each one of them do. I have another picture I want to show you. This one will hit even more close to home. Do you know who that is? Yeah, Anthony Bourdain passed away a couple weeks ago, parts unknown, on CNN. He struggled severely with depression. I could put some pictures up of some of you on the screen. I'm not going to do that because some of you struggle deeply with depression. Some of you struggle with these kinds of things. And here's the big point for the sermon today I want to give you. People can hide their depression, but with God, nothing is hidden. People can hide their depression, but with God, nothing is hidden. God sees, and God cares, and God understands when nobody else sees and nobody else understands. Let me just give you some statistics on depression. I'm talking major depressive disorder. Approximately 15 million Americans suffer with that. 7% of the population, 18 years or older. Statistics I read say 350 million people worldwide suffer with depression. The median age is like 32. It happens more depression in women than men. As many as 1 in 33 children and 1 in 8 adolescents have clinical depression. See, depression is real, and some people are really good at hiding it. You know, I've met some good Christian people, lovely Christian people, and someone's depressed, and they might say to them, suck it up. Get over yourself. It's just you. But I want to tell you, it's real. It's a real problem for some people. They can't just suck it up. They can't just get over it. It's real, and we need to empathize with them and understand that it's real. You know, there are all kinds of reasons that people get depressed. You know, life takes a turn you weren't expecting. The marriage falls apart. The kids don't follow Jesus. The business tanked. And you find yourself, God, I really thought I could see where this was going. God, did I do something wrong? Are you even there? Sometimes you get older. Maybe your health starts to change. That might lead to depression. Like a few weeks ago, we have a middle school student in our school here, First Baptist School. I don't know who she is. I don't know her name. But my wife, Pam, she teaches here at the school. And this middle school student said to my wife, she said, Mrs. Brewer, can I ask you a question? She said, sure. She said, are you and Pastor Brent related? And Pam was like, yeah, we're related. And then she says, are you Pastor Brent's daughter? Now, if I find out this girl's name, she's never graduating from our school. All right, she's going to be in middle school the rest of her life. Man, that can be depressing. I'm like, do I look that bad? I mean, come on. You know, Pam told me that. I was like, let me look at myself in the mirror a little bit. Wow. The passage we're going to look at today deals with lots of things. I want to take it in a direction about depression. We're going to learn today that even godly people get depressed. Do you realize that? Like Elijah, we're going to look at him. It's our last sermon in the series. Elijah suffered with depression, and even godly people get depressed. Let me just kind of put this in context to you before we look at 1 Kings chapter 19. Elijah was a prophet of God. He had just won a great victory before all Israel. Essentially, here's what Elijah did, to put it in modern terms. He rented out Madison Square Garden of his day, and he challenged Baal, the champions of the day, to a public duel. And his victory was epic. Here's how he was outnumbered. He was outnumbered 850 to 1. And Elijah didn't squeak out like an undeserved victory in the last 2 minutes of game 7. Like it was game 1 and it was game over. And all the people fell on their faces before God and they said, "The Lord is God, the Lord is God." What a moment. You think confetti would start coming down from the ceiling. That's when you put your hands up and say, like, "I'm out. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm out." You leave on a high. You ride off into the sunset. Elijah's going to retire. He's going to revel in that victory for the rest of his life. But instead of this high that he experienced on Mount Carmel, it's followed by a spiritual low. You know, almost, as you'll see, a kind of depression. And isn't our lives like that sometimes? Right after some victory, some spiritual high, you go back into some spiritual low. Maybe you fall into the same old temptation. You begin asking yourself, is something wrong? Now I realize today depression's a loaded word. There are many different kinds, ranging from people who are discouraged to those who are clinical, chemical issues going on. And my purpose today is not to diagnose different kinds of depression or provide one solution to all of them. But I think in this passage, you'll see a lot of things that speak to different dimensions of depression. So I want you to follow along. 1 Kings 19, I'm going to start reading verses 1 and 2. It says, Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done, how he killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "May the gods punish me and do so severely to you if I don't make your life like the one of them by this time tomorrow." So I want you to notice, Elijah doesn't even get a plaque. Jezebel hasn't repented. She hasn't been deposed. Far from that. She's still on the throne. She's barking out orders, and she orders his death. So he goes into hiding. Look at verse 3. Elijah became afraid and immediately ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba that belonged to Judah, he left his servant there. But he went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he sat down under a broom tree and prayed that he might die. He said, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my fathers." Safe to say, Elijah's depressed. He wants to die. What he thought would happen hasn't happened. He's angry with God. He thought he knew God and what he could expect. Now he's just not so sure anymore. I was reading last week, only a few months after Charles Spurgeon, who is maybe the greatest preacher known to mankind, at least across the sea. Famous English preacher, Charles Spurgeon, he was a pastor in London. His church exploded in growth. The church went from 300 to 400 people to over 10,000 people. You might say, well, that's great. And it was great. But guess what? Spurgeon had a lot of enemies. That always happens. Things go good, people start hating on you. So Spurgeon got a lot of hate mail, people saying he was an egomaniac, a cult leader, churches shouldn't be that big. So people are launching all kinds of attacks at him. Well, one day he's speaking to his church, huge crowd, 10,000 people. Somebody came in from the back and yelled, "Fire!" Well, 10,000 people tried to get out of this place thinking there was a fire. There wasn't a fire. 7 people were trampled to death. The disaster devastated Spurgeon. People close to Spurgeon said he never got over it. I mean, have you ever felt like this? You do everything right, God seems to come through, and then, bam, setback. Like, where did that come from? That's what Elijah was dealing with. Look at verse 5. It says, he lay down, he slept under the broom tree. Suddenly an angel touched him. The angel told him, "Get up, eat." He looked, there at his head was a loaf of bread baked over hot stones and a jug of water. So he ate, he drank, he lay down again. And the angel of the Lord returned for a second time and touched him. He said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." So he got up, ate, and drank. Then on the strength from that food, he walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. He entered a cave, he spent the night. Suddenly the word of the Lord came to him, and he said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of armies. But the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, tore down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're looking for me to take my life." So what's God doing in these verses? I see a couple things. The first one is God sends an angel of rest. God sends an angel of rest. You know, angels in the Bible, in case you don't know, are always on assignment. They're never just like roaming around and coming back to God and saying, wow, God, you never believe what I just saw. This angel is like sent to Elijah to take care of him. So what does the angel say to Elijah? Does he say to him, hey man, you need to get some faith? Or Elijah, you better get it together. No, what does he do? He touches him, and this is my interpretation now. He touches him, and he makes him some nice hot pancakes. And then he tells him, like, take a nap, and then he sends him, like, to a cabin in the mountains for a little vacay. That's the way I look at it. But I want you to notice, God sends an angel of rest. But here's the second thing I want you to notice I see here. God listens. You notice what he said? He says, what are you doing here, Elijah? You know, whenever God asks a question, it's not to seek information. Like God already knows the answer to the question, and he's giving Elijah a chance to express his own feelings, and God listens. Do you see that in verse 3 if you look down? That Elijah had pushed away his traveling companion or his servant. He left him a day's journey away. You know, when you're feeling a little despondent, what do you want to be? A little depressed? You're like, leave me alone. Like you want to be left by yourself. Can I just encourage you, don't follow that impulse. I know you feel like it, but here's what Christian counselor Dave Paulison says. He goes, things in a secret garden always grow mutants. Things in a secret garden always grow mutants. So God listens to him. Here's the third thing I see from the passage. God gives his word. Look at verse 9. He's going to address some lapses of faith in Elijah to broaden his perspective a little. We'll see that in a little bit. Before we do, let me point out, you have got 3 different approaches to dealing with depression in these verses. See, people can hide their depression, but nothing is hidden from God. God ministers to Elijah physically. Do you notice? There was touch, and there was food, and there's a nap. He deals with him spiritually. He deals with his wrong view of God. He deals with him psychologically. He listens to him. And depending on your worldview, you probably gravitate to one of those 3. You know, some people view humanity, as it were exclusively or primarily physical. So they say this, anytime you're depressed, you should take some time off. You should get rid of anything that causes you stress. You should take a pill. You know, others, though, view humanity as if it were exclusively spiritual. These are people who say to you, oh, you're depressed? Show some faith. Let me pray for you. Quit sinning. Get over it. Like, they think the idea of, like, taking a pill or identifying physical causes to depression is essentially to betray the faith. But the third group views depression as primarily psychological. They say, like, just talk it out, get some friends around you. Here's what you need to do. You really just need to vent. But I want you to notice this. God uses all 3 because God designed us that way. See, God made you and I a psychosomatic being. You're not just a soul without a body. You're not a body without a soul. You're a soul united, clothed with a body, and you can't separate the 2. Sometimes, you probably never heard a preacher say this before, but I'm going to say it. Sometimes you don't need a sermon, and you don't need prayer. Some of you, what you need is you need a nap. All right? Now, maybe that's like your take-home point today. I would appreciate it if you didn't apply it right now, though, okay? But maybe you need a vacation. Maybe you need a weekend away with your spouse. You need to read a good book. And by good book, I mean, don't go and read a book called How Not to Be Depressed. Maybe some fiction. You know, Winston Churchill had 3 hobbies throughout his life he always practiced. Here were his 3 hobbies: movies, novels, and painting. And at the height of World War II, when he was most stressed, he would take 2 hours each evening to do one of those 3 things. Why? He was taking care of himself physically, so he had the strength to take care of the nation. So God comes along, he ministers to Elijah physiologically by allowing Elijah to talk out his feelings. He's a friend to him. You know, the Psalms are filled with people venting to God. You know, being godly does not mean pretending your emotions aren't there. Sure, some of your emotions need to be corrected. Not every emotion is legitimate, but you can't correct the source of your emotion if you don't get it out there. Our emotions are not usually good or bad. Our emotions are simply indicators of what's going on down deep inside of us. Kind of like the fire alarm in your house. If your fire alarm goes off this afternoon, you don't go over with a hammer and beat it and say, well, shut that thing up. There might be a more severe problem. See, our emotions are simply indicating what's going on inside of you. It's not that you need to contain the emotion, but you need to figure out what is the source of this emotion. Where is it coming from? So expressing the emotion often helps you figure out what's going on down deep inside so you can correct it. So what would I encourage you to do? Get a journal. Write out your feelings like David did. See, the Psalms, I'm reading through the Psalms right now every morning. I read one this morning. I'm doing it all year long. I'm doing my meditation in the Psalms for the next year. The Psalms are like David's prayer journal. You ever read some of the Psalms? Like, not all of the Psalms are like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. You know, some of the Psalms are like, are you allowed to say those kinds of things to God? I mean, some of them are pretty salty. And the other thing we need to do is, like, we need to get people around you. Like, some of you, like Elijah, maybe have left your friend and you've been isolated. Terrible mistake. I know you want to, like, wallow in your pain, but things that grow in a secret garden always grow mutants. So God ministers to him psychologically, physically, but he also ministers to him spiritually by giving him his word. Now, I can't diagnose which one of these problems is your problem. Usually, not always, it's a combination of these things. But what I'm going to say from here on out applies mostly to spiritual-based depressions and discouragements. But even though you don't think your depression is spiritual, here's why you should listen. Because there are probably some spiritual dimensions tied up in your emotion, more so than you realize. I want to show you a little chart on the screen. This is from the Development of Spiritually Rooted Depression from the Biblical Counseling Coalition. These are like stages of depression. It starts many times with disappointment. There's confusion, or there's sadness, or there's unfulfilled expectations. And then it leads maybe to discontentment. You're like self-righteous. You think you're a lot better than everybody else. Like, you didn't get the job. You're like, well, I didn't get the job, but that guy's a terrible husband. So you like all kinds of self-righteousness, judging everybody else. You're jealous. Maybe you fantasize about their destruction. And then that leads to despair. What's despair look like? It's when you get lethargic. Sometimes you can't even get out of bed. You have trouble working through the day. You have trouble being a good mom, a good dad. You give up on your responsibilities. And where this kind of depression leads is it leads to destructiveness. Here's where it ends up when it's really bad. You can become suicidal or homicidal. But the early signs that you're really depressed and destructive is a critical, hostile attitude. That shows you're really depressed about something. So I would ask you all this question. Do you see yourself anywhere on this chart? Are you anywhere on this chart at all where you see yourself and you're like, yeah, I'm somewhere on there? You're depressed. So here's God's word to us, to the discouraged. Look at verse 11. He says, go out, stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence. At that moment, the Lord passed by. A great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains and was shattering cliffs before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. And after the fire, there was a voice, a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle. He went out. He stood at the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? See, God's voice in our lives doesn't always come in the way we expect it to. But that doesn't mean that God isn't speaking. Just because God is not working like you expected him doesn't mean he's not at work. See, that's the point here he's trying to make. Elijah on the mountain, he's like, I thought you were going to come with the same kind of things that you came to Moses with, like in the fire, in the earthquake. You assumed that I'm not working, but God says, I am. I am working. If you look down at verse 15 to 18, God reveals to Elijah his plan. He's working with a pagan king Elijah never heard of to bring judgment on Ahab and Jezebel. And here's what it says, that God has 7,000 other people who haven't bowed the knee to Baal, who Elijah seems totally ignorant of. So you know what Elijah had done? Elijah had put God in a box, like we often do. He expected that God can only work in one way. And when God didn't work in that one way that he expected, he assumed that God was not there. See, Elijah thinks that God's let him down, but God hasn't let Elijah down. Elijah's limited view of God and how God he thinks works has let him down. So I want to look now at a few things to encourage you today. First of all, in a time of discouragement, you must defer to the wisdom of God. Because God is often doing work in ways that you don't know. Like, you ever get to that stage in your life, you look back and you see in a time maybe 5 years ago where it looks like God was absent, but he was actually doing some of his greatest work. And I want you to think about this. If already from your limited perspective, because you're not God, some of you need to tell yourself that every once in a while. You're not God. From your limited perspective, if you can see how God worked 5 years ago, just think, if given enough time, like eternity and heavenly perspective and heavenly wisdom, you'll be able to see that God had a purpose in all of it. You and I, we must defer to the wisdom of God when we're depressed. Here's a second thing. We must confront the lie. Twice in this passage, God asks Elijah why he's depressed. Twice Elijah responds with a mixture of truth and error. So I'm going to give you a quiz right now, okay? True-false quiz, you can answer out loud. 50-50 chance, all right? So I'm going to ask it, and you tell me if this statement is true. Elijah said this, I have been zealous for God. He says it twice in the passage. Is that true or false? Are the answers up there? All right. Don't put those up yet, all right? See, some of you, that's what you did in school, all right? All right, let me give you the second one. The Israelites have rejected you, true or false? Yeah, the Israelites reject God? True. They have killed your prophets. Is that true or false? And then he says, Elijah says, I'm the only one left. True or false? It's false. There's 7,000 other prophets, he says, that you don't know about, right? God's got 700 faithful people. Elijah doesn't know. And listen, he's going to raise up another prophet with twice the power Elijah had. Do you know what his name was? Yeah, Elisha. And then there's going to be another person he's going to raise up 800 years later. You know what his name is? What that prophet's name was? Yeah, Jesus. But he says, Elijah says, he alone is left. Do you realize how wrong that statement is? Elijah's coming, Elisha's coming, Jesus is coming, but this is how despair and depression often works. The momentum of a few true things leads you to a dangerously false conclusion. You're like, it's all lost, God. It's useless. My family will never change. My friends will never listen. My workplace will never change. False, false, false. It's never going to get any better, ever. False. There's no one who cares about me. False. I'll never be happy. False. Your depressed self is whispering these conclusions to you, and you've got to stop listening to them. Jared Wilson, who's an author, among other things, he says this, stop listening, start talking, start preaching gospel over your life. And don't mumble. Take hold of yourself and preach. And I would say this, be long-winded if you have to be. Like, I shouldn't be the only long-winded preacher. And then they just cut my mic out. It's one of those days. Oh, there it's back. Good. All right. You know, when I'm discouraged or depressed, I may feel alone, but I'm not. Like Jesus went through Gethsemane and he prayed, my God, why have you forsaken me? So that in my dark days, I never have to question if God has forsaken me. Listen, I may feel like all hope is lost or it's all out of control. It's not. I want you to think about it. If there was ever a time when it looked like things were out of God's control, it was at the cross. Because that's when wicked people, the Jezebels of that day, were not just trying to kill Jesus, but they actually killed Jesus. And instead of it being the greatest time that evil was in charge, it was the time that God was doing his best work. Right? We could say it like this. It was a Friday of despair, but a Sunday of resurrection. See, my future is not dim. It may look dim. The resurrection declares it's not. That when I go through a Friday, when I go through a trial, a Sunday is around the corner. I'll be happy again. I'll have joy again. See, tell your depression and your sadness that its days are numbered. And even if it should, God forbid, last to your dying breath, it'll be vanquished for all eternity while your redeemed, glorified soul will escape to everlasting joy in the Father's presence, whose presence is fullness of joy and whose right hand are pleasures forevermore. I mean, preach to yourself a little bit. Here's a third thing. You must get back to your assignment. If you look at verse 15, the story ends with God telling Elijah to get back to the business of being a prophet, giving the word of God, training up men of God. And for you, whatever you should be doing, no matter how despondent you are, no matter how underappreciated you feel doing it, you need to get back doing it. Being a dad, being a mom, being a wife, being a faithful husband, being a witness to your friends even when they aren't listening, being a good, God-honoring, gospel-demonstrating boss or employee. And the Bible says, be steadfast, immovable in that, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing your labor is not in vain. You might say, well, they never thank me. Your labor isn't in vain. I gave them a cup of cold water. They never said thanks. If you gave it in Jesus' name, it's not done in vain. See, your work should be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. All right, so here's how I want to conclude this. People can hide their depression, but with God, nothing is hidden. Can I ask you this question as we close? Who is the primary preacher in your life? It shouldn't be me. It should be the Holy Spirit, and it should be you. You know, we need to say like David said to his soul. I love Psalm like 103. You know it, don't you? Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name, who forgives my iniquities, who cleanses me from all my... Who's David talking to there? Himself? He's talking to his soul. See, there is no pit so deep that Christ is not deeper still. And the only thing that can overcome a deep well of despondency is an even deeper arm of God's grace. God takes depression and says, you are not alone. I never stop working. I never leave you. And if you hang in there, you're going to see my resurrection power. So be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because your labor is not in vain. Do you all understand? I'm sure you do once I say it. But do you all understand that there are people that come into this room every week who are despondent, who are depressed? Do you understand that? That, you come in and, you come in, I get to my seat. This is my seat. I've been sitting there for 10 years. You don't even know the people around you. And, you're sitting there in your own little world. But that person you're sitting beside, the one in front of you, behind you, may be going through a really tough time. And if you just say to them, good morning, it's good to see you today. That can make a difference. Maybe they're coming in here and they're like, all right, Christians, I'm done with them, but I'm going to give it one more try. And they end up sitting right beside you. Are they going to hear anything come out of your mouth? Are you just going to sit there and like, more people. Don't know them. Don't want to know them. I would tell you, like, as a church, man, I think you need to at least greet people, and you need to let them know that somebody does care for their soul. And speak to them and say, man, it's good to see you, glad you're here. Because we don't know where people are at. So a couple weeks ago, one of you went on social media and outlined paragraph by paragraph your severe depression. And then you went on Shine FM 95.1 and told about your severe depression to all the listening audience in Baltimore. I didn't hear that part, but I read. I have her permission. She was here the first service. She's like, use my name. Many of you know Erin Branham, who attends church here, is one of the DJs at Shine FM 95.1. She went through a severe depression. It's outlined on her Facebook page, and she talked about it on the radio one day. I read that, and I felt real sorry, like, you know, man, I need to pray for Erin. How can I be in her life? Let me send her a message. Let me try to encourage her. But you know the second thought that entered my mind after I read that? How did I miss that? I speak to Erin almost every week here at church. How did I miss it that she was going through such low time in her life? I wonder if some of you, there are people around you and you're missing it. They always got that smile on their face. You're like, they good. But are they? Maybe you're going through that right now. You're going through some kind of severe depression and despondency. And I would just tell you, God cares. God understands. We want to care. We want to understand. You're not alone. God is with you in the struggle. He was with Elijah. He's going to be with you. Start preaching that to yourself. God was with this one, and God's going to be with me. He's going to see me through this, and he will. He'll be there to comfort you. Some guy, I won't mention his name to you, he's a member here. After the first service, he goes, what are you doing this week? I'm like, lots of stuff, but you want to go hang out? He's like, yeah, I want to hang out. He says, I'm going to come and bring you a ticket, and we're going to fly to Denver this week. I'm like, cool. When are we leaving? When are you picking me up? He says, I have a friend out in Denver. It's so depressed, I think he's about ready to commit suicide, and he won't take my calls. So he says, I'm going to go buy myself a plane ticket this afternoon, and I'm going to fly to Denver and say to him, listen, man, you've been away from Jesus for too long. I'm going to talk to you about your depression. Maybe some of you need to pick up a phone today. Maybe you need to send a letter. Someone you know, because listen, the struggle's real. It's real. But there's hope in Jesus. There's hope in the Word. Elijah found that hope. You can find it too.